Well, hello and welcome to my Saturday live stream. Happy to be here with you. For the last month, a little more than a month, I've been doing Saturday live stream broadcasting to provide historical context and as much historical truth as I'm able to in a short period of time to the episodes featured in the History Channel's Project Blue Book series. And this week, for episode 5, I'm covering the Foo Fighters. I just want to let you know before I jump into that, I will be doing a special live stream tomorrow. Well, it's actually a broadcast of a recording, but it will be premiering on YouTube of an interview that I did with Russell Targ, the legendary physicist who really more than anyone else is responsible for organizing the remote viewing program that was so famous, sponsored out of the Stanford Research Institute for years and years. He worked with Dr. Hal Puthoff very closely on this. Anyway, I did a very excellent interview with Russell. I would encourage you to attend that with me tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. One of the big things that you'll get to look forward to is 10, nearly 11 minutes of never before seen, I guess we could say, teaser footage of the film Third Eye Spies. That film has not yet been released. It is a documentary. I've seen it. Tracy and I have seen it together, and it is the best, I think so far, the best documentary treatment of the remote viewing program. And it's really Russell's special project. Really is kind of works off of a lot of his research. Hal Puthoff is in there, Joe McMoneagle is in there, Ingo Swann, Pat Price, Helga Hammett, a lot of the legendary remote viewers who worked for the intelligence community back in the 70s and 80s are featured in this. It is a fascinating film. So I've got about 11 minutes. The creators of the film were nice enough to provide it for me for my interview with Russell Targ. So that will be there as well. If you want attend, I'll be there live with you. Tracy will be there tomorrow. That's Sunday, 2 p.m. Eastern. So be there on the YouTube channel right here. Now, I want to jump right into the Foo Fighter phenomenon. It seems to me, first of all, for those of you who don't know, what's Foo Fighter? Isn't that the band from the 90s? Yes, but they got their name from something, and they got their name from a UFO phenomenon. That is World War II UFOs. That's essentially what the Foo Fighters were. They were given that name. I'll actually get into that in just a few minutes. But what we're talking about is sightings of what we would today call UFOs by pilots during the Second World War, of often light phenomenon, not always light phenomenon, however. Sometimes objects were seen as actual physical objects. I'm going to get into that. So there was a lot going on here, but primarily what you always hear, what I always hear, and I really want to argue against this, is that the Foo Fighters are primarily explainable as German technology of World War II. And I'm going to do my best to explain to you why that's a misguided notion at best. In short, the main reason I would argue is that because I don't think people are generally aware of the immense numbers of excellent Foo Fighter sightings in the Pacific theater of World War II. Keep in mind, in case you forgot, World War II didn't just happen in Europe. World War II happened around the world, and a lot of it happened in the Pacific Ocean area. And I'm going to describe a lot of those cases to you. And they are very problematic if you're trying to explain Foo Fighters as German tech. It just doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense either as Japanese tech, for that matter. So I'm going to jump right in. I do want to discuss some interesting European-based Foo Fighter sightings to you. Before I get into any of that, I would recommend an excellent book done by one of the premier researchers on Foo Fighters in the world. His name is Keith Chester. He has a book called Strange Company: Military Encounters with UFOs in World War II. And I'm mentioning this book. I have it on Kindle, which you can get, or you can get the hardcover. Chester did a tremendous amount of original archival research to dig up these reports. I think more than anyone else out there. There are some other excellent Foo Fighter researchers who've been doing this a long time, people like Barry Greenwood and Jan Aldrich, and many, many others. But I would say if you really want to dive into the Foo Fighter phenomenon, go check out Keith Chester's book, Strange Company. Highly recommended. And some of the cases that I'll be talking about are from his book, and some are just cases that have been known for a very long time. The first one I will mention from the European theater, all right, took place over Holland, and it was given two different dates, March and then June, but I think it's March 25th, 1942, where you have an RAF bomber, that's Royal Air Force, British bomber, over Holland, over a lake called Zee. And this is 1942, and he sees a well-lit orange spherical something following his plane. And they're, it was pretty close, maybe 100 yards, maybe 200 yards away. And the pilot is named Roman Sabinski. We have his name. And he tells his tail gunner, shoot that thing. It's wartime. They don't know what this is. It's clearly not an Allied craft. They assume it's German. So the thing was, whatever this thing was, apparently jumped from just off the left wing to the right wing at ridiculous speed, almost instantaneously. So anyway, the gunner is shooting at this, but and it appeared that they were hitting it directly, but there was no effect. And from what we're told, the object just darted off, and at a speed that they estimated to be like about 1,000 miles per hour. So that's incredibly fast. I want to show you a map of what I'm talking about here. I've got a few maps. I pull these off from Google Earth. Pretty straightforward. You can see this is Netherlands at Zee in Holland. That's March. I've got March 25th, 1942. And so let me continue here. And I've got another map. Actually, let me just show you here. This is the Bay of Biscay. And this is also off the coast of France in the Atlantic Ocean, or at least adjoining the Atlantic Ocean. And my screen is not sharing. Let me get this down right a little bit better. Here we go. I hit the wrong button. So that's the Bay of Biscay. It's off the western coast of France, and you can see that right there. Now, this one is interesting to me because it came to the UFO researcher Leonard Stringfield, who collected, a lot of different reports, including Foo Fighter reports. And we're told that there was an outstanding photograph of this object, but the photograph has never appeared. So Stringfield had a testimony from someone, initials CJJ. And according to what Stringfield learned, the CJJ was attached to a wing of an anti-submarine squadron, and they're patrolling the Bay of Biscay region in France, outside of France. So we're talking November 1942. The plane's tail gunner sees a massive object. He says, without wings, it appears suddenly behind the bomber. Again, these are in the air. They're looking for German submarines. They see this massive object. There's no wings to it, and it's huge. So they're in shock. The rest of the crew becomes alerted, including CJJ, who is in the nose turret of the airplane. By the time he gets into his gunner's position, virtually everyone on board is watching this thing, and they're watching it for 15 minutes. There's a sergeant. He's busy taking pictures with a K-20 camera. The object soon gains altitude. It does a 180-degree turn, and then it just disappears. One of the pictures, Stringfield was told, this was one taken with a filter, turned out very well. In fact, it was a perfect print, according to the witness. But all these years later, we've got nothing to show for it. So, it's, what is that? Is that one of is it a true story or not? Stringfield got a lot of these cases from people, and, you're in a position where you have to do the best you can, which is you judge the witness, you examine their military records to the extent you can. A lot of these cases came to him with under conditions of anonymity, and I don't know what the status of that particular witness is now. So there's another. I've got a lot of maps here, and I want to show you all of these because I think it's very important to see just where we're talking about for these. So this is, you can see Stuttgart, Germany, and this is a case now we're moving into 1943 September, and this is from a report. So this is information on the observation of silvery colored discs on mission to Stuttgart, 6th of September, 1943. And this is one of the cases reported in Keith Chester's book, by the way. So we learned that during an air battle with German planes, there's 2 B-17 crews. They're watching as a third of another B-17 crew is descended upon by a cluster of silver-colored objects that were fairly long in their overall structure, like 75 feet long, 12 feet wide. It's a formation, apparently. Now they're small, so they're looking up to seeing did a German aircraft above us drop these down, and there was nothing there. So it was a very odd thing. All they could note is that some of these objects collided with a B-17, and the wing immediately started to burn. And according to the report, it resulted in the loss of the bomber. I don't know if these guys were killed. They very well could have been. This would be the only fatality that I'm aware of from these Foo Fighters. Incidentally, there's another report, something similar shortly after D-Day. There was a British bomber pilot who reported being tailed, this is in 1944, following a raid over Germany by a cluster of spheres that he couldn't get away from me, and he shot at them and they had no effect. So there's a number of these reports that have existed. So, what are these things? You tell me. There's another one going, as you get into late 1944 into 1945, these types of reports in Europe actually intensify. And again, I just want to show you another map. We're talking same basic area of Europe. And here we go. One of these days, I'm going to have a nice system where I'll have someone doing this whole thing for me. This is just north of Strasbourg on the Rhine River. That's the Rhine River is that border between France and Germany there. Strasbourg is a city on the Rhine. So you start getting a lot of reports in that area. This is from the 415th Night Fighter Squadron. And these guys were very, very prominent in getting Foo Fighter or anomalous phenomena reports during this period of the war. We're getting toward the later months of the war now. It's just getting wrapped up. And you start getting a lot of mission updates from these guys, the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, dealing with these very mysterious encounters. Some of them are almost analogous to dogfights with these inexplicable lights, when meanwhile they're having dogfights with German fighters. Anyway, so one night in November of 1944, just at the area where that arrow indicates, just north of Strasbourg, you have one crew. There's a pilot. We have his name, Edward Schluchter, American, a radar observer, Donald Myers, and an intelligence officer, Fred Ringwald. They're flying along the Rhine River just north of Strasbourg, and they see what they describe as 8 to 10 bright orange lights off their left wing. It's flying through the air, they say, at high speed. These are not tracked on radar, whether in the air or on the ground. No one's registering anything. The pilot, Schluchter, turns toward the lights, and then they disappeared. And this is from the report. Later, they appeared farther away. The display continued for several minutes and then disappeared. Myers, who was the radar observer, gave these objects a name, and he took a nonsensical word used by characters. There was a comic strip back in those days called Smokey Stover. It was a firefighter cartoon, and he called them Foo Fighters. Who knows why? I guess he just liked the cartoon. What you find is that these reports kept coming in. Objects would be appearing alongside craft. They were different colors. They would be red. They would be luminescent, white, yellowish, orange. They would fly along the aircraft for a certain period of time and often just zoom right up into the sky when they were finished. And, very typically there would not be damage to these aircraft. So you had something in the same month, November 1944, over Austria. There's a pilot of a B-17, and he reports being paced by an amber-colored disc-shaped object. In January of 1945, you have a pilot with the 415th Night Fighter Squadron again. He says he's being followed by 3 red and white lighted objects which follow him and engage in these types of evasive maneuvers. In France, same month, January 1945, you have an American pilot. He reports being paced by an object at a pretty high rate of speed for aircraft at the time, about 360 miles per hour, before it just zooms straight up into the sky. That month, January, it was a big month, so you had a report that was issued by the Americans called Night Phenomena, which reached Tactical Air Command from one of the Air Force military intelligence officers. And what they wrote was, "We have encountered a phenomenon which we cannot explain. Crews have been followed by lights that blink on and off, changing colors, etc. The lights come very close and fly in formation with our planes. They are agitating and keep the crews on edge when they encounter them, mainly because they cannot explain them." So that's what that's all about. And by the way, that very same month, though, January 1945, the New York Times published a story about this, about these Foo Fighters. January 2nd, under the title "Balls of Fire Stalk U.S. Fighters in Night Assaults Over Germany." What's interesting about the article is their memory only goes back a couple of months. They're saying, well, this whole thing started in November 1944. No, New York Times, it did not start in November 1944. In Europe, it started in 1942. In the Pacific, as I'm about to get into it, 1941. In any case, they're saying, yes, since 1944, American aviators have been dealing with these mysterious weapons. And to explain it, the balls of fire, they basically follow the military line at the time, or at least one of the military explanations, which is that these were some kind of experimental German sky weapons, and that was put in the article. Now, what none of the American investigators knew was that the Germans and the Japanese had encountered these objects or these phenomena during the war. At least this is what has come to American UFO researchers after the war. And what they certainly didn't explain is that the Pacific Theater was riddled with these so-called Foo Fighters. So let me get into that. And I want to show you again another screen of some of these areas, what we're talking about here in the Pacific Ocean. I did all of this. This is just Google Earth stuff here. So this is September 1941. And you can see we're looking along the eastern coast of Africa into the Indian Ocean. Now, I don't know exactly where this event takes place. That's why I drew a line there. There was a ship called the SS Pulaski. This was formerly a Polish ship that was reused by the British during the war as a troop ship, basically carrying soldiers, ferrying them from South Africa up to Suez into Egypt. So it goes along this route, the East African coastline there. So in September 1941, you've got an interesting case where they're cruising. They're somewhere in the Indian Ocean, presumably along the coast, because that's their route. It's early morning hours. We're talking September 1941. It's a clear, starry night. So it's after midnight, before the sunrise. There's a seaman. We have his name is Mar Doroba. And he just happens to look up and he sees, and he's talking about this years later, some strange globe glowing with greenish light, about half the size of the full moon as it appeared to us. So he calls over one of the English gunners, and the two of them are watching this light, which they are estimating to be about 4,000, 5,000 feet up. So ordinary altitude of an aircraft of that time. And it just followed the ship for about an hour, and then it just disappeared, whatever that was. Not It's not anything interesting there. So now there's another incident of an object that's going at a ridiculous speed of 3,000 miles per hour. And I want to show you again the map that I have here of this. This is in the Timor Sea. And where do we have this here? There we go. So now this is Danish, excuse me, not Danish, Dutch cruiser Trump. Sounds suspiciously like Trump, doesn't it? But it's Trump with an O. And we're talking February 26, 1942. The thing about that date is it is the morning of, it's almost the exact same time as the famous Battle of Los Angeles, if you're familiar with that. I just had an interview with, chatted with David Marler, a researcher who's very much an expert on that. In any case, this isn't Los Angeles. This is the Timor Sea, which, as you can see, is just north of Australia's northern coast, south of Indonesia. We're talking February 26, 1942. So this is something else we learned years later. And I remember reading about this. A lot of Australian researchers have definitely gotten into this one. So there's a man named William Meethorst. And I mean, in fairness, his background, I don't think was ever 100% confirmed to everyone's satisfaction, but he seemed to be where he was talking about. He was on a ship called the, I'm looking for it here, the Trump again, as I mentioned. So in 1957, he's talking about this, and he's living in Melbourne, Australia. He tells a man named Peter Norris of the Victorian Flying Saucer Research Society. He says, while on watch for enemy aircraft just after noon, I was scanning the skies with binoculars when suddenly I saw a large illuminated disc approaching at terrific speed, 4,000, 5,000 feet above us, similar altitude as the Pulaski off the coast of Africa. He said this object proceeded to circle high above our ship, the Trump, and he says after reporting it to the officers of the bridge, on the bridge, they were unable to identify it as any known aircraft. After keeping track of this object for about 3 or 4 hours, as it flew in big circles and at the same height, the craft suddenly veered off in a tremendous burst of speed, and he estimates over 3,000 miles per hour, and disappeared from sight. I don't know how you could estimate the speed of that at 3,000 miles per hour. I mean, we're talking 1940s. There's nothing that could go that fast. But we'll just say it went off at a pretty ridiculously fast speed, so I can get that. That was, still in 1942, and there are many, many more of these sightings that become even, like, I think, with more witnesses and in even a greater sense of drama, because they're occurring now in battlefields. And this next one I'm going to mention is in the Solomon Islands in August of 1942. At that time, Americans were now arriving and fighting in the Pacific Island chains against the Japanese, of course. So this is early on in that whole situation. And this is a sighting of a young man who had just arrived in the Solomon Islands. And I'm going to show you where we're talking about here. This is about Tulagi Island, or Tulagi. And this is something he described as awe-inspiring. His name was Stephen Brickner. He was a sergeant with the 1st Marine Division. So listen to this. He's writing, the sightings occurred August 12, 1942, about 10 in the morning while I was on bivouac with my squad on the island of Tulagi. This, as you can see in that map, it's the southern part of the Solomon Islands. He says it was a bright morning, high banks of white fleecy clouds. He was cleaning his rifle on the edge of his foxhole, he said, when suddenly the air raid warning was sounded. There had been no condition red. He said, I immediately slid into my foxhole with my back to the ground and my face turned up to the sky. These guys are all waiting for Japanese bombers. He said, I heard the formation before I saw it. So it wasn't silent. He said, even then, though, I was puzzled by the sound. It was a mighty roar that seemed to echo in the heavens. It didn't sound at all like the sewing machine drone of the Japanese formations. So very different. He says, a few seconds later, I saw the formation of silvery objects directly overhead. This is an amazing description. He says, at the time, I was in a highly emotional state. It was my 5th day in combat with the Marines. It was quite easy to mistake anything in the air for Japanese planes, which is what I thought these objects were. Totally logical. What else could they be, right? He said they were flying very high above the clouds, too high for a bombing run on our little island. That's an important point. If you're going to have Japanese bombers on that island, Tulagi Island is not big. You can't, at least not in 1942, have your aircraft that high up. You won't hit your target. You've got to get low. And these objects were clearly not low at all. He said they were too high, and he said someone shouted in a nearby foxhole that they were Japanese planes searching for our fleet. He said, I accepted this explanation, but with a few reservations. First, the formation was huge. I would say over 150 objects were in it. That's ridiculously large. He said instead of the usual tight V of 25 planes, this formation was in straight lines of 10 or 12 objects, one behind the other. The speed was a little faster than Japanese planes, and they were soon out of sight. A few other things, he said, puzzled me. I couldn't seem to make out any wings or tails. They seemed to wobble slightly, and every time they wobbled, they would shimmer brightly from the sun. The color was like a highly polished silver. No bombs were dropped, of course. All in all, he said, it was the most awe-inspiring and yet frightening spectacle I have seen in my life. Now, wow. He fought through the Second World War, and this was the most awe-inspiring, frightening spectacle he'd ever seen. I don't see how you can easily attribute this to some kind of illusion. Yes, he was new to combat, but he had been in combat. He knew what Japanese formations looked like. He knew what aircraft up in the sky looked like. These did not look like that. They did not behave normally. They were far too vast a number for it to make any sense at all. 150 Japanese airplanes that high up in the sky? No, this is not logical at all. Not in that war, not in the least. So whatever that was. And again, this is another of these accounts that are reported after the conclusion of the war. So what was it? That's a great question to ask. The thing about it is that these specific encounters continued onward and onward. This is one from Tarawa, which is, again, a major scene of Pacific fighting in the Second World War. This is from April 1944. Tarawa had a lot of very, very vicious fighting by the time the Americans reached that island. And so in April of 1944, we have another bogey, UFO, Foo Fighter, whatever we want to call it. There's a combat intelligence center there, the Argus 16 Combat Intelligence Center at Tarawa. April 1944, they were getting a bogey or blip of some unknown object moving at a very fast speed, at least for that time, of 700 miles per hour. There were no aircraft in 1944 that were able to go at that speed, to say the very least. And, radar operators looked at this, checked over their equipment, rather, and they're asking, is there anything wrong with our equipment? There's nothing wrong with the equipment. Their conclusion was that, well, this might be a supersonic Japanese aircraft. There's no other explanation. That was what they had thought. Of course, it wasn't, and it couldn't have been. And Americans, after the war, intelligence experts realized, no, the Japanese did not have a supersonic fighter or aircraft of any sort during the war. So this is yet another unexplained phenomenon. Now, that nothing was seen visually. It was a radar tracking, but nonetheless, at least to their satisfaction, the radar experts believed that there was nothing wrong with their equipment. So that's what we have. Now, here's another location. We're talking Sumatra, which is a very large island bordering on the Indian Ocean. And a lot of fighting going on in that area at that time. We're talking August 1944. And this is another one that Keith Chester wrote about with his intensive archival work. So August, after striking oil refineries in Sumatra, you have crews with the 468th Bombardment Group are seeing what they call a bizarre and confusing type of new weapon. One of the bomber who's on a mission there has reported that he was under continuous attack for 1 hour and 10 minutes by a swarm of baseball-sized reddish orange spheres that tended to explode into 4 or 5 smaller balls, but they didn't inflict any damage on his aircraft. But he's wondering what are these things? It was absolutely baffling. There were no flashes from the ground or on the ocean that were detected, which would have indicated, someone firing these things. And this kind of thing happened more than one time, because on one occasion, states one report, the course was altered sufficiently to allow tail guns to bear in the direction of the bursts, but 20 millimeter and 50 cal fire from the B-29 had no visible effect. So again, that's what we got. A couple more Pacific cases I just want to run by you before I kind of wrap up my thoughts here. And the last two, only two more that I want to describe, took place actually at the really very end of the war. One, summer of 1945, just before the dropping of atomic bombs on Japan. So the war is still going on in the Pacific. The European war was over at this point. We don't have an exact date. In fact, I wrote about this case almost 20 years ago in my very first book, UFOs and National Security State. And I gave a date or a time that turns out was incorrect. It was based on NICAP's report. They had gotten the date of March of 1945. Turns out it was sometime in the summer of 1945. And it concerns a U.S. Ship called the Delaroff. And let me show you the map here. This is another of these very out of the middle of nowhere types of locations. We're talking the Aleutian Islands here. And that's, of course, the huge chain of islands stretching between Alaska and Russia. And that that town in the middle of the Aleutian chain there is this little place called Adak. Can't even see it. It's so tiny on my screen there. That's not a place you want to go for a summer vacation. Of course, it's probably great for whale watching, so maybe I'll go there. I don't think there's much going on in Adak, but what you have in the summer of 1945 is a very large object was seen by a crew. This is a U.S. Army transport ship called the Delaroff. So all that I know is that it took place at sunset. We don't have the date on this, except it was summer. So it's starting to get dark. So they're in the business of hauling munitions and supplies to Alaska. One man on the Delaroff at the time was named Robert S. Crawford. And I'm pretty sure that Crawford, some years later, spoke to, among other people, physicist James McDonald about this incident. Anyway, he was serving as one of the Army radio men on the ship. And they're headed back to Seattle. And they're just past Adak, so probably a little bit east of where I've got that arrow pointing, actually. But probably not much past it, frankly, a little bit east of that. So Crawford, he's outside and he's near the radio room, and he hears shouts from some of the crews. And he turns around and he sees a large, round object which had just emerged from the sea. And apparently several crewmen had actually seen this object emerge from the water. A good description of this is from my colleague Carl Feint in his website, Underwater UFOs. You can search that out. He's got quite a bit on this. But they had seen it come up from the sea. And they're maybe only a mile away from this object. So it shows very darkly against the setting sun, and it climbs almost straight up for a little while, and then it arcs into a kind of level flight. So it doesn't move in a non-inertial, angular kind of a thing. It seems to take an arc, goes up from the water, arcs gracefully into a level flight, and then it begins. This is the really crazy part. It starts circling the ship. All of the witnesses, Crawford and his shipmates, are convinced this is a pretty big object. His estimate, maybe 200 feet in diameter or so. The very large, that's, 2/3 of a football field. So it's circling the Delaroff, and they could have shot it. It was within easy range of the ship's guns, but everyone held their fire. And maybe because they were too surprised. I mean, it's obviously not Japanese. They're waiting for any sign of hostility, and the craft did not apparently attack them in any way. It just circled 2 or 3 times, and then just moved very smoothly. And it was very strong winds, but it circled very, very easily around the ship, not making a sound. A couple of minutes of this, and then the object just goes off to the south or southwest, and it seems to take off pretty rapidly. The crew saw 3 flashes of light from the area where it had vanished. The captain of the Delaroff did post an extra watch on the ship after that, but they never saw anything after that again. So quite a fascinating encounter. And there's only one more I want to get into, and this was a really interesting one because it was seen by a man who later became one of the most prominent UFO researchers we've ever had. That was Leonard Stringfield. Stringfield was on this transport plane at the time. Now we're talking after the end of the Second World War, August 28, 1945, shortly, just a couple of weeks after the bombs had dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So this is the last, or one of the last, significant Foo Fighter encounters of the World War II era. This one nearly brought Stringfield's plane down. So it's August 28, 1945, and you've got 12 intelligence specialists of the 5th Air Force, and they're on a C-46 transport plane going toward Tokyo in advance of the American occupation forces. And they're approaching Iwo Jima at 10,000 feet. And of course, Iwo Jima during the war had been the scene of one of the bloodiest, most epic battles of the Pacific War of all. But at this point, they're just flying toward Iwo Jima. They're at about 10,000 feet altitude. They see 3 teardrop-shaped objects, brilliant white. Stringfield described it like burning magnesium. And these 3 objects were closing in on their plane on a parallel course. So Stringfield describes, he says, their navigational needles went wild. The left engine started to falter and spurted oil. The plane began to lose altitude. The crew prepared for a ditch. They were going to get out of the plane. Then, just when things were looking really, really bad, the objects in a very tight formation faded into a cloud bank. And at that moment, the plane's engines restarted. The crew safely flew on. And Stringfield wrote about this in his book, Situation Red, from the late 1970s. And it's a very, very interesting book indeed. So those are some of the Foo Fighter reports. Now, I just want to say this. Again, it's not that the Germans could not have had advanced types of aerial objects. Everyone knows that the Germans were working on a variety of advanced types of craft. The question is, do these account for the Foo Fighters? And I just think it's a very, very difficult argument to make. And it's certainly an impossible argument to make that they would be responsible for the Pacific sightings. I just don't think that's a realistic statement at all. And anyone who wants to explain the Foo Fighters as German tech really needs to take into account these multitude of very, very challenging Pacific sightings. What were these things? Well, you tell me. The other thing I would point out is that a lot of the claims that the Germans were creating their own flying saucers and so forth were made themselves by very unrepentant Nazis after the war, who were very clearly seeking to glorify the attainments of their country during the war. And there's not a whole lot of evidence for a lot of those claims, and we need to look at them with a fair amount of suspicion. It doesn't mean that there wasn't anything there, but I do think that a lot of this, the German/Nazi tech, has been a bit overstated. There's not a lot of historical evidence, even to this day, to show that they had operational anything in terms of anti-grav, in terms of field propulsion, or in terms of what we're calling Foo Fighters. Again, don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that they had nothing, but their technology could not explain what people were encountering in the Pacific Ocean. And there's no evidence that the Japanese were creating these Foo Fighters either. Certainly it was not being done by the Americans. Who does that leave you? All right, so there's some very, very incredibly inexplicable sightings here. Now, these were investigated, or were they not investigated? It's a good question. What was the attitude that the American authorities took? Well, we know that these were investigated. You think anything that was this unusual would warrant an investigation, and that's what actually happened. There are at least 2 investigations that we believe took place by the Americans relating to the Foo Fighters. One was by the U.S. 8th Army under the command of General James Doolittle. Seems to have conducted a study, although we don't have any copies of their conclusions of anything like that. It is said that their report concluded that the sightings were possibly German experimental weapons, static electricity charges, misidentification of ordinary objects, or some kind of mass hallucination. In other words, they didn't know what it was. They're just spitballing here. They had no idea. The OSS, which is the forerunner of the CIA, also investigated the phenomenon. And at first, their investigators believed that the sightings were German experimental aircraft, but soon discounted this theory, while Bill Donovan, who ran the OSS, and his staff apparently settled on the notion that the objects, if that's what they were even could be called, were unusual but ultimately harmless. I mean, the thing is, in something as big as the Second World War, it seems to me a number of things can get lost, especially if you're not really getting significant casualties out of it, and if it's not really affecting your prosecution of the war. And that really was the case with the Foo Fighters. What they certainly seem, in most of the instances in which they were encountered, is that they were seen observing, we might say, the scenes of action. I would point out also that there were a number of very well attested sightings by Americans of these types of objects in the United States during the war. It wasn't only in the European or Pacific theater. There were sightings of what we would have to call UFOs over various military bases during 1942, 1943, and so forth. Those did happen. We don't have a lot of those reports, but we have some. So the problem with explaining Foo Fighters in only one way, i.e. as German weapons, is that people end up cherry picking. And, when you cherry pick your evidence, it's very easy to arrive at any conclusion you want. And the problem with the Foo Fighters is that they are just every bit as complex and broad-ranged as the UFO phenomenon that we all know and love after the Second World War. So it's not simply one easy explanation, I think, that comes to mind relating to the Foo Fighters. And that's what makes it a genuine element of the UFO phenomenon. I would like for them to be one simple explanation. What it looks like to me is that these objects were not ours. There are too many of these sightings, too many of them. And in fact, there's a lot of consistency if you really go through the reports in the Pacific and over Europe. So what do you have? Well, you've got something that's very, very unsettling. And this is one of the things, again, in the History Channel's Blue Book series, where I think it's possible that they overstated the trauma that these objects inflicted on the pilots after the war. But nonetheless, it's a fair statement that these sightings were actually, to some extent, a bit traumatic. I mean, I read you the statement of the Marine over in the Solomon Islands who said it was the most awe-inspiring yet terrifying thing I've ever seen in my life. And there are a number of these other pilots where clearly they were agitated, clearly they were spooked by these objects. So there is truth in saying these were deeply disturbing to the pilots. And, you know, once the war ended, they're in a really difficult position where they encountered these things and they get no resolutions. Like, what were these? These were not Japanese. These were not German. They were not the enemy. They were something else. And we don't, to this day, we don't have a formal explanation. And it appears that there has been, you know, a cover-up and concealment of information. I mean, Stringfield's, one of his witnesses, had said that they took a perfect photograph of one of these things over the Bay of Biscay off the coast of France. Well, we've never seen it. And I think this is the case with a lot of these things. By the way, over at Barry Greenwood's website, UFO Historical Review, he's got one entry that deals with the Foo Fighters, and there's some original documents that are available. John Greenwald's website, The Black Vault, ditto, has got a lot of this stuff that you can go through and look through some of these documents. There's not a huge amount that's available, but there's enough to keep you busy for a while. Foo Fighters were a genuine historical mystery. And that's what makes the UFO subject so fascinating. It is a genuine mystery. They are not easily explained by any one explanation. But in my opinion, none of the explanations, particularly when you're talking about the Pacific Theater sightings, none of those explanations sound like terrestrial technology to me. You can make up your own mind. In the European ones, it's possible that some of them might have been German weapons of some sort, but even there, I'm not 100% convinced. I think Joseph Farrell talked about the Stuttgart raid, where the objects are kind of pinging into the wing of one of the aircraft as a potential German weapon, and I wouldn't disagree with that. But the problem is we don't know what those weapons would have been to this day. So we're really at a loss with all of these. Well, that's all I've got for you. So I hope you found that interesting. Again, I'll remind you, I'm doing a live stream. God, I keep saying that. That's not a live stream. I'm doing a premiere of a recording of an interview I did just recently with Russell Targ on remote viewing. It feels like a live stream, but it isn't. But we'll be premiering it, and I'll be there in the chat room, and that will include nearly 11 minutes worth of unique, never seen before trailer / teaser footage of the movie Third Eye Spies. So I would encourage you to go check it out. That'll be tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern time. So check your time zone, get everything calibrated. I'll be there. Tracy will be there, and it'll be very, very interesting. We're going to lead, by the way, with the 11 minutes of Third Eye Spies. So you'll see at least an advance showing of that film. The creators were very, very nice to allow me to have access to that and show it for you. So that's it. If you like what you see here, I would always encourage you to like the video, subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you want to keep up on what I do every week, you can subscribe to my free newsletter. For that, go to Richard Dolan Members or richarddolanpress.com. Both of them on the front splash page have a click to subscribe to the free newsletter. Keeps you up to date on everything that I'm up to in the course of every week. So, all right, that's it. And thank you very much for your support. Until next time.